How's it going, everybody? I am ZBilbs and I'm back here today with another metal albums ranked video. Today I'm going over another classic power metal band, and that of course is Stratovarius. Now, I've been on a massive binge of power metal. If you know my channel, you know that I love power metal more than any other subgenre. And so I've been trying to go through some of the classics, a few of the newer ones. So I've finally gotten around to Stratovarius, and these guys absolutely blew my socks off. They have quickly become one of my favorite bands of all time. I had listened to them only briefly. Their most recent album I gave is my album of the year for 2022. And so since I had listened to that album, I wanted to go back and listen to the rest of their discography, and I finally got the chance to, and most of their albums are absolutely great. But there's a lot of them and a little time to do it, so let's just get rolling with the video. Oh, and also next up I've got Camelot and Orden Ogan, so stay tuned in my channel if you enjoy power metal rankings. But yeah, coming in at number 16, I have Twilight Time. Now, a lot of people like early, or at least semi-early Stradivarius stuff. One thing you should know about this list is I tend to like a more modern style for, I guess, most kind of power metal, and that is definitely the case with Stratovarius. Now, that's not to say a lot of their classic stuff in the 90s I don't like. A lot of that is near the top, but a lot of their earlier stuff is going to be lower than a lot of their more recent stuff, and that is the case with Twilight Time. This is kind of, this is their second album. I feel like they haven't quite figured out their style quite yet. I feel like they figured out with their fourth and fifth albums. This one's got Timo Tolkki on vocals, and while his singing isn't quite as good as Colchipelto, I think he's still got a pretty solid voice. Unfortunately, I find the songwriting on this album really lackluster. There's not too many interesting, engaging choruses or super catchy riffs. I can see why people like this album. It does have kind of a unique, kind of, I don't know, cosmic style to it, but it doesn't really do it for me. The albums I like from this, the songs I like from this album, Break the Ice, The Hands of Time, and Madness Strikes at Midnight are all solid. I wouldn't say they're great by any means, but that's really it on this album. It's not bad, I just find it kind of dull. But yeah. Moving on to number 15, I've got the self-titled album Stratovarius. This is most people's pick for Stradivarius's worst album, and while it's not my least favorite, I definitely can see the case made for it being the worst album. This is kind of after Infinite. It kind of feels like the 2000s Stradivarius just struggled to find their identity. I think the Elements, both of them, is kind of a spoiler. I think that was a downward trajectory, and I think this was rock bottom. I think the band just needed a new spark of creativity, and this was just them just throwing stuff out there, see what would work. It didn't have the signature Stradivarius style. It didn't have the powerful hooks or the cool neoclassical undertone that so many of the other albums did well. That being said, this has one really great song on it. I really love the song Fight. There's other couple decent ones. The Land of Ice and Snow is an alright ballad. Leave the Tribe is alright. United is alright. But as a whole, most of these songs, well, I wouldn't say there's any particularly bad song on this album. Like Twilight Time, I find most of these just kind of uninterested. And for these ones, they just kind of feel lazy, uninspired. So not a particularly great album, and definitely one of the weaker ones that Stradivarius has done. Moving on to number 14, I have got Elements Part 1. Now, I definitely have controversial picks. This is the first controversial pick on this list. I know the Elements, both Part 1 and 2, they tend to be all over the place for people's rankings of Stradivarius. Most people lump them together. They're not going to be together for me. I tend to think they're just kind of all right, both of them, but I do think Elements Part 1 is weaker than Part 2. Most people have it reversed because Part 1 does have some genuinely excellent songs on it. Eagle Heart is one of the most iconic Stratovarius songs of all time. I also really love Soul of a Vagabond, and I think Stratofortress, the instrumental on this album, is probably the best instrumental that Stratovarius has ever done. So it's got 3 really solid songs, but I would say those are the only 3 that I like on this album. A lot of people really love Elements. I think it's a little just too long, too cheesy, a bit too overindulgent for me to enjoy that song. And most of the rest, I think, has similar pitfalls as the self-titled album, that it just kind of feels uninteresting and uninspired. So Part 2, I have my thoughts on it in a little while, but I tend to think that the consistency on that one is a little bit better. So while this, I wouldn't say it's a bad album, it's got some bright spots. Overall, I think it's definitely weaker in terms of Stratovarius's discography. Moving on to number 13, I have got Polaris. This was a really hard one to rank because this is, as far as I know, this is the only Stratovarius album that is not on Spotify for whatever reason. So while I was able to binge through all the other albums very easily, this one I had to go and listen through it on YouTube a few times. So maybe this ranking is a little bit skewed because I couldn't listen to it quite as much. But my general impression coming out of this one is that it's good, it's all right, it's got some good songs on it, but it kind of just feels like the new age of Stratovarius, the post-Tolkien era, but not just quite hitting their style, not quite getting as energetic and anthemic choruses as they would get, say, with Nemesis or Eternal. There's still good stuff, but it generally feels like just okay, and it doesn't have anything super interesting or energetic. Some of the best songs on here, Deep Unknown is probably my favorite. Some other solid ones are Falling Star, Forever Is Today, Higher We Go. So it's kind of hit or miss on the songs, whether they're good or just all right. So once again, it's an all right album. It's not particularly bad. It's not particularly good either. But yeah, that is Polaris coming in at 13. At 12, I have got their third album, and that is Dreamspace. This is the last of the Tolkien albums on vocals. And most people say that this is the strongest of the Tolkien albums. I think you could definitely make the case for that. Obviously, Fright hasn't come up yet. I'm a bigger fan of that one than most people, but I think this is actually a pretty decent album. Its only main downfall is it's also a pretty long album, and so I think there's a lot of filler in this album. If this was shorter and more concise, I think it could be a genuinely great album, but it's a little too bloated for me. That being said, there's some excellent songs on here. My favorite in this album is Reign of Terror. I think that one has just got a gnarly, chuggy, heavy riff on it. That's a great song. Tears of Ice might be their best ballad that they've ever done. There's some other decent ones like Chasing Shadows, Eyes of the World, Shattered, Abyss. So there's good stuff, but besides Reign of Terror and Tears of Ice, the songs that I like, I think, are just kind of decent. There's nothing that is particularly standout amidst the rest of their discography, and it's a little bit bloated. So, well, I'd say we're getting more towards the genuinely good albums. I would say this is still very much middling in terms of Stratovarius's discography. Moving on to number 11, we have Elements Part 2. Now this one, it's clumped together for most people, and I understand why most people like Part 1 better because Eagle Heart is great and all of that. But as a whole, as an album, I think Part 2 is better, as I said, because it is more consistent. While Part 1 has the higher of highs, Part 2, there's more songs that are solid as a whole. Know the Difference, Liberty, what else we got? Alpha and Omega, Awaken the Giant, and also my absolute favorite on this album is Dreamweaver. That one I think stands up there. I think it's underrated. It's as good as Eagle Heart and Soul of a Vagabond in my opinion. So that's 5 decent to great songs on that album. So it's far more consistent. It's still got a couple of really solid songs on it. So while I still would say it's one of the more middling albums as a whole, because there are some mediocre tracks on this one, I definitely like it more than part 1. So I am putting Elements Part 2 at 11. And moving on to number 10, another one that I alluded to earlier that I like more than most people. I've got their debut album, Fright. Now, this one catches a lot of flack for reasons I don't quite understand. This one, I mean, it kind of the case with their first 3, their Tolkien albums, that they don't have quite their signature power metal style yet. But this one tends to be lumped in with like the least like their actual style, the most speed metal album, and I don't quite get the backlash it receives. I mean, being a speed metal album does not inherently make it a bad album. I mean, you look to Halloween, a lot of people's favorite album of Halloween is their debut, Walls of Jericho, and that album is clearly pre-power metal, just a straight up speed metal album, and people still absolutely adore that album. And this, I feel like, is kind of the same thing, so I don't get why people dunk on it so much. But, I mean, part of the reason it's not as high is even though I enjoy the style, and I don't knock it for not being their, developed style would come later already. It is a little bit lacking in the consistency there. There's not quite as many great memorable songs as later albums would have. But overall, like, I'd say this is the first album on the list where I'd say, like, yeah, that's a good album. It's worth checking out and giving another shot if you don't like it. But also let me know in the comments why do so many people put this at the bottom of their list. I don't quite get it. But good songs on this album: Night Screamer, Fire Dance, Black Knight, False Messiah, and then the best 2 on this album is definitely Future Shock and Fright Night. Fright Night is, I think, one of their better, longer epics. It's just super fun chorus, just super interesting style to it. I like kind of the eerie atmosphere that this album gives, so even though it doesn't fit great with the rest of their discography, I think on its own it is a pretty solid album. Moving on to number 9, I have got another new era album, and that is Elysium. Now this one I think was definitely a solid step up from Polaris. It kind of felt like it took the groundwork that Polaris did and just expanded on it, start giving more powerful anthemic choruses, and is just a better, more interesting album as a whole. And I think that's kind of the case, already getting into little spoilers, with all of their new era albums. I think they keep getting better and better and better, which is kind of controversial. Most people like Nemesis the most of the new albums, but Elysium, good songs on this album. Darkest Hours is probably my favorite. It's an excellent way to start the album. Under Flaming Skies and Infernal Maze are both excellent. Move the Mountain, that's a great ballad. The Game Never Ends is pretty solid. So some really solid, some even top tier songs on this one. Unfortunately, it's not exactly the longest album, and it doesn't have the most top tier songs. And one interesting thing, a lot of people absolutely love the long, like freaking 18-minute long Elysium song. And for me, if there is a song that's 10 minutes or more, it's got to do something like really interesting that will keep my attention for those, like all of those minutes. Of not many bands have been able to do it pretty well. I think Halloween does it well with their long songs. Obviously, I think the best long track of all time is Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Iron Maiden, and Stratovarius takes cracks at it from time to time, and I think maybe only one time do I like one of the long tracks, and Elysium is not it for me. So let me know in the comments why you guys like this one so much. I just find it a little bit drawn out and not interesting as a whole. But and that's the case. There's a couple of misses on here, but this is still a solid album overall, a pretty good album actually, and we're moving into probably all of these albums here on out are great to amazing essentially. So there's just that many great Stratovarius albums. But yeah, that is Elysium at number 9. Moving on to number 8, I've got another spicy, controversial pick for all of you, and that is Destiny. This is a lot of people's favorite. It's usually in the top 3 for most people, and I like it. I think it's a good album. I just didn't think it was the absolute best. For the main reasons that, while I think it's really consistent in its quality, there's not really any filler or fluff in here. There's only a couple songs I think I would skip. Its top tier best songs just do not rival the top tiers of other albums. And then it doesn't have as many top tier songs as other albums. Most of the tracks in this album I think are just decent without being truly exceptional. My favorites on this album, Destiny, most people say that that's like the best song Stratovarius has ever done. I think it's good. Once again, maybe it's just because of the length and all of that, but it's not particularly mind-blowing for me. SOS, No Turning Back, 4,000 Rainy Nights, I really liked that at first, and then it just got a little bit too repetitive the more I listened to it, but still a good song. Playing with Fire is also good. My two favorites on this album, definitely Anthem of the World. That's just a really fun one, and Rebel is definitely my favorite. I think that one's a little bit slept on. Most people don't talk about that song. They talk about this album, but I think it's excellent. So overall, not really too much negative to say about this album. It just does not reach the heights for me that other Stratovarius albums do. Moving on to number 7. Another one that's consistently put in the top 3 that I have lower than most, and that is Episode. And this is the album that I think, well, I would say Fourth Dimension is the first album where Stratovarius gets their signature style, but this is definitely the one where they kind of cement it, and the neoclassical power metal style comes into full effect. And I think this one has the similar highs and lows that Destiny has, which is why it's at a similar placement. I think it's pretty darn consistent in its quality. There's not much filler. It is decently long, so that makes it kind of hard. So there is like a little bit of fluff here and there, and just there's a lot of songs that are decent without being great. But the songs that I like on this album, Forever, Tomorrow, Babylon, Stratosphere is a great instrumental. Speed of Light, a lot of people love that song. I think it's just decent. Once again, there's only 2 songs on this album that I think are truly excellent, and that is Father Time, one of the best Stratovarius songs of all time, for sure. And Will the Sun Rise is also very good. So it's a really good album. Once again, just similar downfalls to Destiny. It's a little bit light on the heavy hitters, and it's a little bit bloated, but still a great album as a whole. Moving on to number 6, ahead of Episode just by a hair, and this is a blasphemy for most people, but I've got Fourth Dimension. I think this is very similar in its style to Episode, and I think it's just has a little bit higher of highs, which propels it above Destiny. It's got one of my favorite Stratovarius songs overall. Distant Skies is my favorite on this album and is one of my favorite of their early discography. It's got some other great ones, Stratovarius, good instrumental, Against the Wind, We Hold the Key, some other really solid ones. Lord of the Wasteland is excellent, Nightfall is excellent, Galaxies I think is a little underrated. I think that one's pretty solid too. So not too much more to say about this one. I think it's kind of just the album that cemented Stratovarius' style. I think it's pretty consistent in its quality. It's got some top tier songs, just does not quite reach the heights of other ones. Moving on to number 5. This is generally seen as the best of Stratovarius' new stuff, and that is Nemesis. This album, it's a long album, and usually it's hard for long, I think 11, 12 plus track albums to do super well, because usually there's a lot of filler. And while there's a little bit of filler in this album that I think holds it back a little bit, there are so many absolutely top tier banger songs on here. I would say 5 and up, each one of these albums are absolute masterpieces, genuinely. It was hard to place these next 5. but I had to. Like, I could just list off tracks in here and just classic after classic. Unbreakable is fantastic. Halcyon Days. Out of the Fog is my favorite on the album. That's fantastic. Castle in the Air is great, underrated. If the Story is Over is excellent. Nemesis is probably my second favorite. Fantasy is decent. So there's a lot of amazing songs holding it up. I would say it's the weakest of the top 5 just because it is very long and there definitely is some filler. But this is when Stratovarius and their new style, they finally figured out what they've been building to with Polaris and Elysium, because it's got just some absolute fantastic songs, and in my opinion they keep expanding on this style going forward. But yeah, Nemesis, absolutely great album. Moving on to number 4, we got some more blasphemy for all of you, because at number 4 I've got the fan favorite Visions. Now this is usually, this one or Destiny are kind of the universal consensus for the best Stratovarius album. And obviously I really like both of them. I like Visions more than Destiny, but 4th is the highest I could put it, sadly. Now, why is it at 4th, might you ask? And honestly, the answer is, as I said earlier in the video, I kind of just like the new style of Stratovarius more than the older, like, 90s style. So purely personal bias there, because there's not really anything wrong with this album. I think basically every single song is good on this album. It doesn't have just quite as many songs that are like truly like top tier, like my favorite style of Stratovarius, but I could just literally just go down the album and list them all, and they're all good. I'd say the best of the best on this album, The Kiss of Judas, Legions. My favorite is probably The Abyss of Your Eyes. Paradise is excellent, obviously. Holy Light is one of their best instrumentals. One that is the most popular Stratovarius song is Black Diamond. I like that song, but the keyboards on that one are just a little bit too much, so I don't like it as much as most people. But this is just a classic album. It's an excellent album. It's consistent. It's got some all-time best Stratovarius songs. They're better albums in my opinion, at least albums that I like more. So moving on to number 3, this one was so close. I kept going back between Visions and this one, but I like this one more just by a hair, and that is Infinite. This is the other like favorite. It's kind of Visions, Destiny, and Infinite are usually in the and maybe Episode are in the conversation for the top of most people's Stratovarius lists. But yeah, I think this album is absolutely excellent. Same things that I said about Visions. It's incredibly consistent in quality. It's got a little bit of filler in there that I don't love because it's a decently long album, but it's got some absolutely classic top tier songs. Hunting High and Low, that might actually be the most popular song next to Black Diamond maybe. Some other great ones, Phoenix is spectacular. A Million Light Years Away is probably my favorite on the album. Infinity is excellent. That's, I think, one of the few longer Stratovarius songs that I actually really like. Freedom is good. Glory to the World is good. Millennium is good. So once again, just a really solid album. Just doesn't have quite my favorite style of Stratovarius, and that'll be in these next 2, but Infinite still absolutely great album. Moving on to number 2, I have got Eternal. This one, it's kind of weird. It kind of feels like people either love this one or they hate this one. I feel like there's kind of divide between people who either love the new style or hate it, and if you hate the new style, you're gonna hate this album, because this one is just like Stratovarius in their classic style, and then just injecting a ton of just more modern proggy influences. They take the powerful courses that they've been building to in Elysium and Nemesis and just crank them up to 11. And for a lot of people, it's too much. For me, it's absolute perfection. When they hit, they hit. And this has got probably my favorite Stratovarius song of all time on it, and that is Rise Above It. The chorus on that one is just unmatched by basically any power metal chorus I think I've ever heard. There's no more like anthemic, powerful chorus than Rise Above It. So give that one another shot if you haven't heard it, if you heard it and you didn't love it, because I love it. But there's so many other amazing songs on this album. Shine in the Dark is so good. Lost Without a Trace, In My Line of Work, My Eternal Dream, Feeding the Fire. There's some other decent ones like Man in the Mirror and Fire in Your Eyes. There's a couple of skip ones at the end of this album, but man, the songs that are great on this album are so freaking great. So yeah, Eternal, I love it. I think it's a masterpiece. But to be fair, it is a decent amount below my number one album, and that is Survive. So this is my favorite album of 2022, and even since I listened to it then, I have grown in my appreciation for it even more. So it might be a recency bias or some kind of bias, since this is the album that got me into the band. It tends to be lately that the newer of a band's, the newest album that a band put out that got me into it tends to be my favorite. So it's maybe I just like the modern power metal style the most. Maybe it's recency bias, as I said, but who knows? This is my favorite, so it is what it is. Now, the songs I like on this album is every single one of them. There is not a single bad song. There's not a single mediocre song. There's not even a single just average song. Every single track in this album ranges from good to amazing. You could just go down the entire freaking album and all of them are good. This is the most consistent by far. It doesn't have a song that's quite as good as Rise Above It, but Survive is probably my second favorite Stratovarius song of all time. There's so many other absolutely top tier amazing songs. Broken, Demand, We Are Not Alone, Breakaway, Before the Fall. It's got another really good long song in Voice of Thunder at the end. So this is just Stratovarius' new style, but come to its fullest fruition and just made with no filler, just great consistency across the board. So yeah, that is Survive. Is my favorite Stratovarius album, that is. But yeah, that is my list. Let me know in the comments, how would you rank the 16 Stratovarius albums? How bad was my list? Let me know. Stick around on my channel if you want to see some more power metal albums ranked. I'm going to re-rank some other power metal bands in the future once their new albums come out, like Dream Evil, Hammerfall, Powerwolf. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you later.